The most loving person you will ever meet is usually the one who ends up walking away. And that is a reality that most people simply cannot wrap their heads around. We are taught that love conquers all and that the person who cares the most will stay forever. But right now, that person, the one who was the emotional heartbeat of their family, is likely sitting alone in a quiet room, miles away from the people they once tried to save. To the rest of the world, they look like the difficult one. They look cold, distant, or even heartless for cutting ties. But the world only sees the exit. They didn't see the decades of slow-motion destruction that led to it. The empath didn't leave because they ran out of love. They left because they ran out of life. They left because staying meant watching their own soul dissolve into nothing. If you have ever felt a bone-deep exhaustion after a simple Sunday dinner, or if you have spent 20 minutes in your car outside your parents' house just trying to steady your breathing before you walk through the front door, you know exactly what I am talking about. You aren't difficult. You are depleted. This isn't a case of a family argument gone wrong. It is a case of a person finally realizing that they cannot keep everyone else warm by setting themselves on fire. For the empath, family estrangement isn't a choice made in anger. It's a last-ditch effort at survival. It's the moment you realize that the people who were supposed to be your sanctuary have actually become your greatest source of trauma. The way this begins is through the systematic weaponization of your sensitivity. From the time you were small, you were told that your ability to feel was a flaw. You're too sensitive, they said, usually with a roll of the eyes or a tone of disgust. Whether it was your mother, your father, or an uncle at a holiday dinner, they treated your empathy like a manufacturing defect. They made you feel like you were born with a disease simply because you could see the pain they were trying to hide. Because you were a child, you didn't have the tools to realize they were wrong. You believed them. You took that label, too sensitive, and you buried it deep in your identity, right next to the parts of yourself you were taught to be ashamed of. But here's the thing about sensitivity. It doesn't just go away because someone tells you to toughen up. Instead, it goes underground. It turns into a silent, high-frequency radar that never shuts off. You became a master at reading the room before you even walked into it. You learned to track the subtle shift in your father's breathing, or the specific way your mother set down her glass, because those were the early warning signs of an emotional storm. You weren't just being a kid. You were an unpaid emotional bodyguard for the entire family. This isn't just spirituality. It is raw neuroscience. Your brain is wired with hyperactive mirror neurons that literally simulate the feelings of those around you. When they hurt, you hurt. When they were anxious, your heart raced. You grew up as a physiological sponge, absorbing the unspoken grief, the hidden anger, and the generational trauma of people who refuse to do their own healing. You carried the weight of their secrets and the burden of their moods, all while being mocked for the very sensitivity that allowed you to help them. You were the only one who felt everything, the one who stayed the longest to try and fix the unfixable, and the one who tried the hardest to keep the peace. But a sponge can only hold so much contaminated water before it starts to rot. The breaking point didn't happen because you stopped caring. It happened because your nervous system finally screamed, "No more." You didn't just walk away from a family. You walked away from a slow death so that you could finally learn how to breathe. To truly understand why you feel so drained, you have to look at yourself as the family sponge. This isn't just a metaphor, it is a literal description of how your life has functioned since the day you were born. Think about a sponge sitting at the bottom of a bucket. If that bucket is filled with clean, clear water, the sponge stays clean. But if you fill that bucket with mud, oil, and filth, the sponge doesn't have a choice. It soaks up the grime because that is simply its nature. It doesn't decide to get dirty. It just exists in a toxic environment. And because it is absorbent, it becomes a reflection of the water around it. In a family system struggling with narcissism, addiction, or unspoken rage, you were that sponge. You spent years soaking up emotional waste that didn't even belong to you, absorbing the tension in the kitchen, the bitterness in the living room, and the silent treatments that lasted for days. The tragedy of the family sponge is that eventually you get full. There is only so much toxicity one nervous system can hold before it reaches its capacity. For years, you functioned as the family's emotional filtration system, taking in their chaos and trying to give back peace. But nobody ever stopped to realize that the sponge was getting heavy, dark, and brittle. Every time your parents fought, you absorbed the shock waves. Every time a sibling acted out, you soaked up the stress. You became the person who could feel a vibe shift from a mile away, and you learned to hold your breath to keep the house from shaking. You weren't living your own life. You were living as a container for everyone else's unresolved baggage. When you finally reached your breaking point, when you stopped being able to absorb the mess, or when you finally stood up and said, "I can't carry this anymore," the family didn't offer you a hand. Instead, they acted confused. They asked what was wrong with you. They treated your burnout like it was a personal attack or a sudden change in personality. But the truth is, the system only worked because you were willing to be the dumping ground. The family peace was actually just a weight being carried entirely on your shoulders. They didn't see the therapist, the peacemaker, or the mood monitor. They only saw a tool that was suddenly refusing to do its job. They grew comfortable with you being the one who never had problems, the one who always understood, and the one who always forgave the unforgivable. This role was never a choice, it was an assignment. You were drafted into being the family's emotional stabilizer without your consent. You were trained to believe that love is synonymous with self-erasure. You were taught that to be a good member of the family, you had to make yourself invisible. If you were too loud, the narcissist felt threatened. If you were too sad, the addict felt guilty. So you learned to shrink. You learned to keep your needs in your pocket and your opinions under your tongue. You became a ghost in your own home just to keep the system from exploding. You were conditioned to believe that setting a boundary was an act of war and that having a basic human need was dramatic or selfish. This is the most direct truth I can give you. The family didn't love you for who you were. They loved you for how well you managed them. They loved the version of you that had no limits, the version that stayed quiet when things got ugly, and the version that always came back for more. When you finally stop being the sponge, the water in the bucket stays dirty, and for the first time, the people responsible for that dirt have to look at it themselves. That is why they are angry. That is why they call you difficult. But you aren't difficult. You are simply tired of being the only person in the room who is willing to drown so that everyone else can stay dry. It is time for a serious reality check on the myth of obligation, because this is the specific trap that keeps the most loving people in the most toxic situations for far too long. We have been sold a dangerous lie that says if you love someone, you are required to endure whatever pain they inflict on you. We are told that family is everything and that blood is thicker than water, as if those phrases are somehow a legal contract that gives people permission to dismantle your mental health. But here is the cold, hard truth. Loving someone does not give them a license to destroy you. Love and self-preservation are not supposed to be enemies. You can hold a deep, genuine love for a parent, a sibling, or a relative in one hand, and in the other hand, hold the absolute certainty that being near them is killing your spirit. These two things can, and often do, exist at the exact same time. You have to understand that love is not a magical force field. It does not possess the power to make psychological harm harmless. If someone is hitting you, it doesn't hurt less just because you love them. The same rule applies to your mind and your heart. Just because you care about someone doesn't mean their manipulation, their gaslighting, or their constant emotional demands aren't leaving permanent scars on your nervous system. In fact, love is often the very thing that makes the damage so much worse, because it's the reason you keep your guard down. You've been operating under the assumption that your endurance is a measure of your devotion, but that is a lie. Standing in a burning building doesn't prove you love the house. It just ensures you'll go down with it. When an empath finally reaches the point where they have to walk away just to survive, they aren't met with a sense of freedom right away. Instead, they are met with a guilt so heavy it feels like a physical weight in their chest. If you have walked away, you know this feeling. It feels like you are a traitor. It feels like you've committed a crime against the people who gave you everything. But you need to hear this clearly. That guilt is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is actually evidence of how thoroughly the family system programmed you to prioritize their comfort over your own life. That guilt is a leftover survival mechanism from a time when you were taught that being good meant being quiet and never leaving. It is the sound of an old, broken alarm system going off because you finally dared to step outside the cage. You aren't abandoning your family. You are choosing to stay alive. There is a massive difference between walking away to cause harm and walking away to prevent your own destruction. If you stay in a toxic system until you are a shell of a person, depressed, anxious, and physically sick, you aren't actually helping anyone. You are just another casualty of a broken dynamic. By walking away, you are making the first healthy choice you've probably ever made, the choice to value your existence. You are finally rejecting the idea that your purpose on this earth is to be a sacrificial lamb for people who refuse to heal themselves. It is not an act of betrayal to choose your own sanity. It is an act of courage to admit that while you may love them, you love your own right to peace more. The moment an empath finally detaches is rarely a sudden explosion. It is usually a quiet, heavy realization that the road has finally ended. They don't leave because they want to. They leave because they've run out of ways to stay. This decision is built on 3 pillars, and the first is raw, unfiltered survival. For the empath, staying in a toxic family system isn't just difficult. It is a slow-motion erasure of their entire identity. There comes a day when you look in the mirror and realize you don't recognize the person looking back, because that person has been entirely consumed by the needs, the moods, and the demands of everyone else. Your nervous system is constantly stuck in a state of high alert. Your health is starting to fail, and your mind is becoming a fog of anxiety. You realize that if you stay for one more crisis or one more holiday, there won't be anything left of you to save. Detaching is a calculated, desperate move to prevent total psychological collapse. It is the act of choosing to breathe when the family dynamic has spent decades trying to drown you. The second reason is clarity, and this is where the magic of the system starts to break. When you are standing inside the hurricane of a dysfunctional family, you can't see the wind. You're just trying not to get hit by the debris. But the second you step back, the second you create physical and emotional distance, the air clears. From the outside, you finally see the patterns that were invisible when you were trapped in them. You realize that the blow-ups, the silent treatments, and the emergencies weren't random events. They were a script that your family has been playing on loop for generations. You see that the roles were fixed, the ending was always the same, and your job was always to be the one who suffered to keep the play going. In this clarity, you have a life-changing epiphany. The guilt you've been carrying like a heavy backpack for 30 years was never actually yours. It was handed to you by people who didn't want to carry their own shame. And for the first time in your life, you realize you are allowed to just put it down and walk away. Finally, the most powerful reason for detachment is the hunger for self-discovery. For an empath who grew up in a toxic system, their entire self was built around being a reaction to other people. You were the helper because they were helpless. You were the quiet one because they were loud. You were the fixer because they were broken. But who are you when you aren't fixing, helping, or reacting? Most empaths have no idea, and that realization is both terrifying and exhilarating. Detachment creates a sacred space where the noise of other people's expectations finally stops. In that silence, you get to own your life for the very first time. You get to find out what you actually like, what you actually think, and what it feels like to wake up without wondering whose emotional mess you have to clean up today. This isn't just about leaving a family, it is about arriving at yourself. It is the beginning of a life where your energy belongs to you, and for a person who has spent their whole existence being a mirror for others, that is the greatest freedom imaginable. The final stage of this journey is recognizing that your detachment is not the death of love. It is the radical, necessary birth of self-respect. For a long time, you were convinced that loyalty meant staying until there was nothing left of you. But true loyalty starts with yourself. The outside world, people who grew up in healthy, supportive environments, might look at your choice and offer shallow advice about working it out or forgiving and forgetting. They don't understand because they haven't felt the slow, agonizing erosion of their soul under the weight of a system that demands everything and gives absolutely nothing back. They haven't experienced the hollowed-out feeling of being a person who exists only to serve the emotional whims of others. When you detach, you aren't becoming unloving. You are finally drawing a line in the sand and declaring that your life has intrinsic value. You are deciding that you will no longer be a sacrificial lamb on the altar of someone else's refusal to heal. The most incredible part of this transformation is what happens to your sensitivity. For your entire life, you were told that your deep feelings, your intuition, and your empathy were a defect or a burden that made you weak. But once you remove yourself from the toxic environment, you begin to see the truth. Your sensitivity is actually your greatest gift, your silent superpower. Think of it like a high-performance engine that was being fueled with garbage for decades. Once you stop pouring your energy into vessels that can't hold it, into family members who are bottomless pits of need or manipulation, that energy finally stays with you. You discover that your ability to read a room, to feel deeply, and to connect authentically isn't a flaw. It's a massive advantage when it's used in the right places. You stop being a victim of your emotions and start being the architect of your own peace. When you finally stop trying to fix people who aren't asking to be fixed, a massive amount of emotional bandwidth clears up. For the first time in your life, you are free to find a community that actually deserves you. You are free to seek out relationships where there is a genuine two-way street of respect and care. In these new spaces, you aren't valued for what you do, how much you can tolerate, how well you can keep the peace, or how much trauma you can absorb. Instead, you are seen for who you actually are. You discover the profound beauty of being known by people who don't need you to shrink so that they can feel big. You find friends, partners, and chosen family who look at your sensitivity and see strength rather than a target. This is the ultimate victory for the empath. You move from a state of constant depletion to a state of focused power. You realize that your quote-unquote brokenness was actually just a reaction to a broken environment. By choosing yourself, you haven't lost your capacity to love, you've simply refined it. You've learned that love without boundaries is just self-destruction, and that the most powerful thing you can do with your empathy is to protect it. You are no longer the family sponge or the emotional dumping ground. You are a person with a rare and beautiful depth of feeling, finally standing in the sunlight of your own life, surrounded by people who would never ask you to disappear just to make them comfortable. Your silence isn't a sign of defeat. It is the sound of a superpower finally being used for the person who deserves it most, you.